He plowed straight through my new driveway. He parked his equipment on my lawn. He ran over a burn pile and popped his own tires, then blamed me. And when I finally stood my ground, he called in a favor from a cop friend to shut me down. He thought his badge of county commissioner made him untouchable. He was wrong. And by the time this story ends, he'll have paid for a crop he never should have planted on land that was never his. And he'll have signed the receipt himself. If you've ever had someone bigger, louder, or more important than you try to walk all over your property, your work, or your word, this story is for you. Stick around, because this one has flat tires, a bulldozer, a very unhelpful cop turned unlikely ally, and a corn harvest that ends with a grown man losing his elected seat. Like this video, subscribe if you want more real justice stories, and let's get into it. Picture 80 acres of open land, rolling fields, a little rise at the back where the ground sits highest and driest, perfect for a house. That's exactly what our narrator, we'll call him Dan, had in mind when he bought the property. He wasn't a farmer. He wasn't from around there, not really. He lived in the city, hours away from the land he'd just sunk his savings into. But he had a plan, and he had patience. Building a house doesn't happen overnight. Long before the foundation goes in, you need a driveway. A real one, engineered to handle trucks, gravel, cement mixers, everything a construction crew needs to get up to a build site. So Dan got to work early. He divided his parcel carefully. Driveway along the high ground, fields on either side left open for whoever might want to farm them in the meantime. He staked out his future yard with flags and twine. He had the driveway shaped. A hump down the middle for drainage, the way a real driveway should be built, and paid to have 10 loads of gravel delivered and spread. This wasn't a dirt path. This was a visible, deliberate, unmistakable piece of infrastructure sitting right there in the middle of open farmland. And that's when the neighbor showed up. Enter SFB. We're going to call this man SFB, Dan's own nickname for him, and by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why he earned it. SFB had rented the fields from the previous owner for years. Now that Dan owned the land, SFB wanted to keep that arrangement going, on his terms. His opening offer? 60% of what he used to pay. When Dan raised an eyebrow at that, SFB generously bumped it up to exactly what he used to pay. Still low. Every other field in the area was going for $75 an acre. SFB was offering $50. Dan didn't need the money badly enough to get taken advantage of, and he said so. Twice. Eventually, they landed on $70 an acre, a fair middle ground. But Dan wasn't about to hand over unrestricted access to his own property. He laid out 3 conditions, plain and simple. 1. No planting anywhere near the staked-out yard. 2. No planting on the driveway, which, again, was not subtle. It had a crown in the middle. It had 10 loads of fresh gravel on it. You could not mistake it for a field. 3. All corn had to be off the ground before December 1st because Dan needed that adjacent field cleared to build a pole shed. SFB grumbled. SFB complained. But SFB signed. In writing. Dan made sure of that. The first betrayal. 2 weeks later, Dan, still living in the city, got a call from his dad, who lived right next door to the property. SFB had plowed straight through the driveway, planted corn right over the gravel, right over the crowned, engineered surface Dan had paid to build. And as if that wasn't enough, he'd parked his equipment directly on the freshly seeded lawn Dan had marked off with flags and twine, driving right over the markers to get there. Try to sit with that for a second. Imagine paying for a driveway, watching it get built, and then finding out someone drove a planter over it and buried it under corn seed. Imagine your new lawn, the one you haven't even seen finished yet, getting rutted up by tractor tires because a grown man couldn't be bothered to read the flags in the ground. Dan was livid, but he wasn't there. He was hours away, getting secondhand updates over the phone, powerless to do anything except tell his dad to put the driveway back the way it was supposed to be. Then came the second discovery. SFB had also driven his tractor straight over an old burn pile on the property. The remains of a torn-down outhouse, mostly burned but clearly still there. The result? 2 flat tires. On SFB's own tractor. From SFB's own carelessness. The blame game. Here's where it gets almost funny, if it weren't so infuriating. On the muddiest day of the month, SFB rolled up to Dan's father's door. Not to apologize, not to explain, but to demand to know why Dan had plowed down his driveway and flattened his tires. Dan's dad, calm as ever, laid it out for him. You shouldn't have planted corn in the driveway in the first place. And as for the tires, how exactly was Dan supposed to have flattened them when he hadn't set foot on the property since SFB parked there? SFB didn't have an answer. He just left, muddy and irritated, having accused an absent man of sabotage he clearly caused himself. The clock runs out. Fast forward to December, harvest season. Half the rent was due before planting. Dan never saw it. The other half was due at harvest, and the corn wasn't even out of the ground yet, despite the December 1st deadline sitting right there in the signed contract. Dan had a shed to build. He'd already scheduled gravel delivery for December 2nd or 3rd. He drove out to SFB's house to remind him, face to face, that the corn needed to come out and that he still hadn't been paid a cent. Only SFB's wife answered the door. Dan explained the situation calmly. She said she'd pass along the message. SFB never showed, never called, never harvested. December 2nd came. The utility company arrived to stake out electric lines for the shed. The corn was still standing. December 3rd came. The gravel and building materials arrived, right on schedule. The corn was still standing. December 4th arrived. The morning the construction crew was set to build the shed. And that's when Dan got the call that pushed everything over the edge. The breaking point. The crew couldn't even get down the driveway. SFB had parked his massive combine harvester at the entrance, completely blocking the road in. Whether it was intentional or just carelessness didn't matter anymore. The effect was the same. Dan was being locked out of his own property on the exact day he needed access most by a man who had already broken his contract twice over. Dan didn't hesitate. "Drive over the cornfield," he told them. There wasn't supposed to be corn there. The agreement's expired. Think about the weight of that moment. This wasn't rage talking. This was a man who had been patient, who had put everything in writing, who had been ignored, disrespected, and now physically blocked from his own land, finally saying enough. The crew got to work. They had to bulldoze about 1/10 of an acre just to level ground for the gravel pad. The shed, a standard 40x60, started going up. The confrontation. That afternoon, SFB showed up. Not calm, not apologetic, screaming about his ruined fields. Dan didn't flinch. He reminded him of the contract, the one requiring all corn removed before December 1st, the one SFB had signed. SFB's response? He claimed he never signed anything. That was the wrong thing to say. "If you never signed a contract," Dan told him, "and I never got paid for the rent, then legally, that corn is mine. I can do whatever I want with it." The favor. SFB wasn't just an angry neighbor. He was a county commissioner. And commissioners, apparently, have friends in law enforcement they can call on for personal favors. Sure enough, a cop showed up at Dan's property, sent there by SFB himself, with instructions to stop further construction damage. The officer arrived already primed to see Dan as the villain of the story. But Dan had something SFB didn't: paper. He handed over the signed contract. He explained that SFB hadn't paid a dime of the agreed rent. He showed that the crop was still standing weeks past the deadline written into the agreement. He pointed out the flattened lawn, the ruined driveway, the damage SFB himself had caused months earlier. And then he asked the officer a simple question: "What would you do in my position?" Here's where the story flips completely. The officer, to his enormous credit, looked at the evidence and made a decision most people wouldn't have expected from a friend of the man who'd called him in. "I have access to a combine," he said. "I'll cut the corn down myself. If he pays you what he owes, I'll hand the corn over to him, minus what it costs to harvest it, and minus rent for storing it. If he doesn't pay you, I'll cover your rent myself." Let that sink in. The cop who was sent to intimidate Dan ended up being the one who made things right, cutting through the drama and simply enforcing the deal that had been signed in good faith from the beginning. By January, SFB paid the officer. The officer paid Dan. But SFB, even in defeat, tried one last petty move. He showed up with the payment and a receipt backdated to the previous year, purely for his own tax benefit. The officer wasn't having it. He refused to sign unless the date was corrected to reflect reality. Furious, humiliated, and out of options, SFB initialed the correction himself. The very next year, SFB was voted out of his commissioner seat, investigated and removed for using his position for personal gain. Dan has a strong suspicion about who tipped off the right people. At the end of the day, this wasn't really about corn or gravel or a driveway. It was about someone assuming that patience meant weakness, that because Dan wasn't standing on that land every day, he wouldn't notice, wouldn't push back, wouldn't hold anyone to their word. SFB learned the hard way that a signed contract doesn't stop mattering just because you decide to ignore it. Sometimes the most satisfying justice isn't loud or dramatic. It's just someone finally being held to the agreement they tried to walk away from. If this story had you fist pumping by the end, smash that like button and drop a comment. What's the most satisfying case of karma you've ever witnessed? And if you want more stories where the underdog comes out on top, hit subscribe, because we've got plenty more where this came from.